Hey guys, so tonight we're not talking about battles, kings, or some epic crusade that dragged on longer than your aunt's wedding toast. No, tonight we're slipping into something a little quieter, a little slower, and honestly, a little sadder. We're going to talk about the people who rarely get their names written down in the history books, medieval servants. Now, servants had one main job: make their lord's life easier while their own lives stayed about as comfortable as a bed made of straw, fleas, and a prayer. And as you can imagine, temptation was everywhere. Picture working in a castle where you're polishing goblets made of actual silver, pouring wine from barrels that could pay your yearly wage in a week, and cleaning kitchens full of roasted meat, while your own supper is basically brown bread and cabbage water. Of course, some servants thought, well, maybe I'll just take one little thing. But here's the catch. Medieval society didn't exactly shrug at theft, especially not when it came to stealing from a lord. Punishments could be surprisingly creative or just brutally straightforward. And tonight, we're going to glide through the whole strange world of what happened when a servant's sticky fingers got caught. So, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's drift back to a time when losing a spoon could literally get someone whipped in the courtyard. Let's start slow. First thing to understand is that theft in medieval Europe wasn't always judged equally. Stealing a loaf of bread from a village market stall wasn't the same as lifting a gold buckle off your master's cloak. Theft from above, from your lord, your master, your employer, was seen as especially insulting, because in the medieval mindset, hierarchy was sacred. The whole order of the world depended on everybody knowing their place. So when a servant stole from their lord, it wasn't just about the object. It was about disobedience, it was about betrayal, and it was about breaking the invisible chain that tied peasant to noble. The punishments reflected that. If you were lucky, and I do mean lucky, you might just get a public scolding, maybe a fine, maybe some extra labor. Basically, congratulations, you'll be scrubbing latrines for the next 6 months. But if the theft was serious, or repeated, or if your master woke up in a particularly bad mood, punishments could escalate quickly. Whipping was the bread and butter punishment. A nice, straightforward lashing in front of your fellow servants just to make sure everybody learned the lesson together. Whips, rods, sometimes even just a thick stick from the garden. And because this was medieval Europe, there was a flair for theater. The whipping might take place in the courtyard, in front of the household, or even in front of villagers at the market. Nothing teaches honesty quite like public humiliation. Now, some lords, especially the ones who thought a little too highly of themselves, liked to get inventive. One common trick was branding. Yes, literally heating up a piece of iron and stamping it onto a servant's skin, usually the hand. Because nothing says "I stole once" like carrying a permanent scar for the rest of your life. It was the medieval version of a criminal record, except you couldn't exactly apply for another job without someone noticing the giant burn mark. But we're still in the lighter end of punishments. Let's drift a little further into the darker waters. Imagine stealing something valuable, like silver coins or jewelry, or, God forbid, the Lord's favorite hunting hawk. That's when the punishment could easily slide into mutilation. Fingers chopped off, ears cut, noses slit. Yes, it sounds grotesque, but the logic was, if a servant used their hands to steal, well, maybe they didn't need all of those fingers anymore. Convenient, right? There's a grim record from 13th century France where a kitchen servant who stole from the pantry was caught, and the lord decided cutting off a hand was more merciful than hanging. The servant survived, but with one hand less and the lifetime reminder not to grab extra cheese. And, of course, the ultimate punishment was execution. Hanging was the go-to. Servants who stole significant amounts or who repeated the crime might find themselves strung up at the gallows. Lords didn't exactly want to be seen as soft on crime. After all, if one servant got away with stealing, suddenly others might get ideas. And nothing scared people into obedience like watching someone swing at the village crossroads. What's wild is that sometimes the stolen object was absurdly small. There's a record from England where a servant was hanged for stealing a few shillings worth of goods. A few coins, a life gone. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Now, before you think every single lord was a total monster, let's just smooth that thought out. Some masters actually tried to be fair. They recognized that servants stole out of hunger or desperation, so in a few cases they preferred to punish symbolically. A short stint in the stocks, sitting in the town square with your hands and head locked in a wooden frame while villagers laughed and maybe threw some turnips. Humiliating, yes. Deadly, no. And after a day or two you'd be released back into service, with, of course, your reputation in tatters. And if you were a servant in a monastery or church household, things got even stranger. Instead of whips or gallows, you might get spiritual correction. Basically, being locked in a small cell, fed bread and water, and forced to pray about your sins for days or weeks. Not exactly cozy, but probably better than losing a hand. Let's also float over to the legal side. Technically, lords didn't have unlimited freedom to punish however they wanted. Medieval law codes had rules about theft, with different levels of severity depending on the value of the stolen goods. But, in practice, the lord's word was law within his estate. If he said, "This servant stole my comb, therefore they must be flogged," well, that was it. No jury, no appeal. Just the raw hierarchy of medieval life. And here's a little ironic twist. Servants were expected to be loyal. They swore oaths, promises of obedience. But the lords, they didn't exactly promise fairness in return. So when things went bad, the whole system leaned heavily against the servant. Stealing wasn't just theft, it was betrayal of trust, which meant the punishments were often harsher than for an ordinary thief in the village.
So let's drift a little deeper into the drafty world of medieval estates. Servants lived under the constant shadow of their lords, and that shadow wasn't just long and gloomy. It was watchful. Theft in this setting wasn't about treasure chests or glittering coins. It was much smaller, much sadder, and far more ordinary. A missing loaf of bread, a chicken that somehow found its way into a servant's basket, a handful of firewood quietly tucked away for a freezing night. Small things, really. But to a medieval lord, those small things weren't small at all. They were cracks in the stone wall of authority, and cracks had to be sealed quickly. Punishments usually started at the lowest level with simple beatings, the kind of punishment lords considered routine, almost boring in its regularity. It wasn't about cruelty so much as about setting an example. A whipping in the courtyard where everyone could watch worked as a reminder that obedience wasn't optional. It was survival. And of course, the irony here is that servants usually stole in order to survive in the first place. If the theft was more serious, grain, meat, or heaven forbid, money, punishments escalated. Some lords had cellars, damp stone rooms that doubled as makeshift prisons. A servant could be left there in the dark, with water dripping from the ceiling and time moving slowly. Others preferred the stocks in the village square, a place where shame did the punishing. Neighbors could laugh, children could throw things, and the weather itself joined in the sentence. And then, for repeat offenders, things turned permanent. A hand removed, an ear sliced away. Brutal, yes, but in the medieval mind, it was practical. Scars carried the message forever, and everyone who saw them learned the same lesson. Execution wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible. Steal from your lord's treasury, or worse, from the church connected to his estate, and a rope might find its way on your neck. Hanging was efficient, public, and symbolic. It said, this is what happens when property and power are touched by the wrong hands. Still, not all lords chose severity. Some were merciful. A servant cock with bread might be scolded, warned, and quietly sent back to work. Not from kindness, necessarily, but from practicality. Hungry workers were weak workers, and weak workers didn't keep manners running. Sometimes, mercy was simply good management. So, punishments weren't just about stolen food. They were about order. They were about reminding everyone who owned what, who held control, and who decided where the line between survival and sin really lay. For the servant, theft was desperation. For the Lord, punishment was duty. Cold, necessary, and very public. Let's float from this now and wander gently into how different regions of Europe handled these things in their own ways, because a stolen loaf in England was not always treated the same as one in France.
Let's drift now into the idea of regional flavor. Because medieval Europe, as you know, was not one single uniform landscape of castles and lords who all thought in the same way. A stolen egg in one place could earn a whipping. The same stolen egg somewhere else might land you in chains, and in yet another place you might simply be laughed at and sent back to your duties. The rules were never quite universal. In England, for instance, punishment was deeply tied to common law. Theft, no matter how small, was considered an offense not just against a lord, but against the king's peace. The phrase itself sounds heavy, but it basically meant that breaking order, even in tiny ways, was a crime against the larger system. So a servant who stole might be dealt with locally by their master, but if things escalated, they could find themselves dragged into the wider machinery of medieval justice. And trust me, that machinery was not designed to be gentle. Across the Channel, in France, justice could take on a more performative edge. French lords enjoyed the spectacle. Punishments often involved public humiliation, stocks, pillories, or parading the offender around the village with the stolen item tied around their neck. If someone had stolen a chicken, you might see them walking in shame, the unfortunate bird dangling as proof. Was it effective? Well, nobody wanted to be the one mocked by neighbors for weeks afterward, so in its own way, yes. Meanwhile, in the German states, things leaned a bit more toward the physical. Harsh corporal punishment was common, often carried out with meticulous formality. Servants might be flogged according to a set number of strikes, and records were sometimes kept of these punishments. It sounds oddly bureaucratic, but then medieval German territories had a talent for paperwork, even when it came to pain. Italy, of course, had its own quirks. Wealthy city-states like Florence or Venice often treated theft as not just a crime but as an insult to civic order. Stealing from a noble household could see you branded on the face, a mark that never faded and shouted your crime to anyone who saw you. It was both punishment and lifelong advertisement of failure. And really, nothing kills your chances of employment like a literal brand that says thief. Now, beyond these regional differences, we should glide into another layer, the church. Because medieval society was never just about the lords, the church loomed over everything, including the manor. And when it came to theft, the church had its own rules, rules that could sometimes soften a punishment, or in other cases make it worse. Stealing food, for instance, was sometimes excused if done out of extreme hunger. The church might argue that survival was a natural right and mercy should be shown. But stealing from the church itself, bread, wine, sacred objects, that was sacrilege, and sacrilege brought punishments that reached beyond this world. Excommunication was possible. Imagine being told that not only were you punished on earth, but heaven itself was now closed to you. For a medieval servant, that wasn't just terrifying, it was soul-crushing. Still, for all these variations, one thing was consistent. Punishments were not only about correcting the thief, they were about sending a message to everyone else. A lord who ignored theft risked losing authority. Servants might begin to think rules could be bent, that hunger justified rebellion, and suddenly the fragile balance of a medieval household would tilt. That was unthinkable. So punishment had to be visible. It had to be memorable, and it had to remind everyone that the system was not theirs to question. It's almost funny, in a dry way, that the very people punished so harshly were the ones keeping the whole machine running. The servants plowed the fields, cooked the meals, cleaned the halls, and made the manor function. Yet, if they so much as touched what wasn't theirs, the hammer fell. Lords relied on servants completely, but also distrusted them deeply. A strange contradiction, but one that defined much of medieval life. Let's float gently into another aspect now, the difference between men and women in punishment. Male servants and female servants were not always treated the same way. A man caught stealing might face whipping, stocks, or mutilation. A woman, however, might be punished in ways designed to attack her reputation. Public shaming, especially, was more common for women, being paraded through the village, hair cut short, or forced to wear a sign announcing her crime. These punishments struck at dignity as much as at the body, because, in medieval thought, a woman's honor was tied tightly to her appearance and reputation. Ruin that, and the punishment lasted a lifetime. And then, of course, there were children. Child servants existed, and yes, they could steal too. Lords often treated them with a strange mix of severity and condescension. A child caught stealing might be beaten, but often it was brushed aside as childish mischief, unless, of course, it was repeated. Then the child could be punished more harshly, sometimes even alongside adults. Because nothing says discipline like whipping a 12-year-old for taking an apple. So we see, punishment was layered. It varied by place, by gender, by age, and by circumstance. Yet the undercurrent was always the same. Theft was not tolerated, because theft chipped away at the illusion of order, and in the fragile structure of medieval society, order was everything.
Think of the pillory, for example, a wooden frame placed right in the middle of a village square, holes cut for the hands and the head, locking a person in place. It wasn't a quick punishment. It was long. Hours, sometimes days, left in public for everyone to see. And that was the point. The thief became less of a person and more of a display. People passing by could jeer, throw food, or just watch. The servant wasn't being punished in private. They were being transformed into a walking, breathing reminder of what not to do. Stocks worked in a similar way. Instead of the head and hands, the legs were locked in. You sat, unable to move, exposed to weather and ridicule. If the day was hot, the sun burned. If it rained, you were soaked. If it snowed, you froze. The punishment was less about physical pain and more about humiliation, discomfort, and endurance. The servant suffered, but the village remembered. And in medieval thinking, memory was half the battle. There were even punishments designed to match the crime, a kind of grim irony. If someone stole food, they might be forced to carry it around their neck until it rotted. If they stole grain, they might be tied to a sack of it and paraded through the manor. If they stole wood, they might be forced to sit on a pile of logs while being mocked. It was theater, pure and simple. The message was, see, the thief is marked by the very thing they couldn't resist. In larger towns, punishment sometimes went beyond humiliation and into ritual. Bells might be rung to announce a thief's capture. The community gathered not because they loved punishment, but because it was entertainment. Medieval life didn't have television, didn't have endless diversions. A public punishment was a show. A grim one, yes, but still a show. Servants caught stealing didn't just suffer, they performed. Symbolism extended even into mutilation. Cutting off a hand, for example, wasn't just a brutal act, it carried a clear message. This was the hand that stole. Now it cannot steal again. Branding worked the same way. A hot iron pressed into the skin, leaving a mark that said, "Thief." It was permanent, visible, and impossible to hide. Wherever the branded servant went, their crime followed them. It was punishment that never ended. And in a society obsessed with order, branding was efficient. No need for constant reminders, no need for lengthy imprisonment. One scar said everything. To modern ears, it sounds cruel. To medieval minds, it sounded practical. But here's the subtle thing about all this symbolism. It wasn't just about the thief, it was about the Lord. Punishment reminded everyone who held power. A lord who punished dramatically wasn't just correcting his servant, he was advertising his authority. Every blow of the whip, every hour in the stocks, every scar, it all pointed back to the man in charge. He owned the land, the food, and in many ways, the people. And punishment was his way of showing he owned the rules too. Sometimes, though, the symbolism leaned more toward mercy. A lord might forgive a servant in public, turning the moment into a display of generosity. "See how kind I am," the act seemed to say. "Even though I had the right to punish, I chose to spare." And of course, this wasn't just kindness, it was politics. Mercy, when given, was as much about reinforcing power as punishment was. Because if a lord could punish and did not, it showed that he alone controlled the balance. He alone could decide fate. In the end, every punishment, whether cruel, humiliating, or forgiving, carried meaning. It was never just about bread, chickens, or coins. It was about symbols. The servant's body became a canvas. The punishment became the paint. And the message was written for all to see. Order would be maintained, authority would be respected, and no crack in the wall would be allowed to spread. Let's float onward now and gently explore how these punishments connected to the rhythms of medieval life itself. Because punishments didn't exist in isolation, they were woven into festivals, markets, and even the passing of the seasons.